Isang napakalaking karangalan ito na malugod kong tinanggap. Lalo na't naalala ko na minsay naging kaugalian ng umpil na mag-imbita ng mga kilalang politiko upang harapin at bahaginan ng kanilang karunungan ang mga manunulat. Hindi po ako politiko, kundi isang manunulat din tulad ninyo. Kaya't napapanahon sigurong tayo naman ang kumausap sa ating mga politiko, hindi man sila makinig sa ating mga pangungusap. At bago pa ang lahat, kailangan kong magpaliwanag na anuman ang aking sasabihin dito ngayong araw ay pawang paniniwala ko lamang at walang kinalaman sa aking panunungkulan bilang Vice Presidente ng Universidad ng Pilipinas. Whatever I say here today will be entirely my own opinion and will in no way represent the position of the university which I happen to serve as its official spokesman. I've been asked to speak on the subject of literature in the time of tokhang, and I'm sure we will all agree that no topic could be timelier and more troubling. I suspect that I was chosen to stand here today, much less for any eloquence, than for the simple fact that even peripherally, my family can count personal losses in this sordid war. As many of you know, I wrote a piece for Esquire magazine last year recounting a horrific moment that no family should ever have to undergo. Let me just read a paragraph from that essay. My wife Beng and I were in San Diego late this July, visiting family and taking in the harmless lunacy of Comic-Con, when we received the numbing news that Loren Cristel Rosales, the girlfriend of Beng's nephew Gab, had been shot dead by a man as she was taking a jeepney ride to work. We found a picture online of Lauren slumped face down on the floor of the Jeep, clutching her bag, and it was the most heartbreaking sight I'd seen, the pain of which Beng's wails could only scratch at. I'd come across ghastlier crime scenes as a sometime police reporter, but this one hit home and hit hard. She was someone we knew and cared for, someone who occasionally dropped by with Gab and whom we shared Christmas lunches with. We had flown to the U.S. for a family vacation and were flying home to a family funeral. Now, as if this wasn't terrible enough, 3 months after Lauren was murdered, her brother JR, a newlywed young man who had flown home from his job in the UK to pursue his sister's case, was himself shot dead by motorcycle riding gunman who remains unknown, like his sister's assailant to this day. To be fair, a word that seems hopelessly inappropriate in these circumstances, no one except the killers and their handlers can say for sure if these murders were part of the government's so-called war on drugs. Neither was a drug user, and the police themselves would admit that neither Lauren nor JR was on their list of suspects. But these murders happened in an environment and in a manner that, as crime waves and police campaigns typically do, anonymized both victims and perpetrators and tossed them all into a wide-mouthed meat grinder that crushed not only flesh and bone, but guilt and innocence together. The term tokhang itself is a corrupted word, a portmanteau of the Cebuano words tok-tok and hangyo, or knock and plead. The very embodiment of courtesy and consideration, conjuring the image of a uniformed policeman, his cap in hand, knocking on the door of a suspect's home and politely seeking information or cooperation. In practice, tokhang has become its opposite. The gentle knock has become the kick of a booted heel, the cap a gun, and the appeal a barked command. As writers and storytellers, we have to marvel not only at the terminal efficiency of this process, but also at the facility with which this brief narrative arc has become a cliché. And like all clichés, has left us increasingly benumbed and unsurprised. In a sense, this is the true victory of the war on drugs, the capture of the passive mind and its habituation to systematic terror. Sabi nga ng kaibigan nating si Father Albert Alejo, sanayan lang ang pagpatay. Ngayon ay hindi na lamang pagpatay ang nakasanayan ng Pilipino, kundi ang mismong pagkwento nito at ng pakikinig sa mga ganoong kwento. Ito na marahil ang pinakamalaking tagumpay ng kampanyang tokhang. Ang pagkawala ng ating pagkabigla at pagtataka at ang pagtanggap ng nakararami sa simpleng naratibang ipinakakalat ng mga may kapangyarihan. Alam na natin ang takbo ng kwento. Lulong sa droga si Juan, kaya pinuntahan ng pulis. Subalit tila hangal itong nanlaban, kaya nabaril at napatay. Ang ikalima o ika-anim na pinatumba ng batas sa isang mahabang araw ng magiting na pakikihamok nito sa krimen at kasalanan. Sa ganitong kalagayan, ano pa ba ang magagawa ng manunulat na nananatiling mulat at palatanong? In this situation, what can writers who have not surrendered their conscience and their writerly inquisitiveness do? Writers come in many forms and functions, which at one time or other may overlap. In this audience here today are not only fictionists, poets, playwrights, and essayists, but also journalists, editors, copywriters, screenwriters, bloggers, and propagandists of all kinds and persuasions. What unites us is the written word, and increasingly these days, the visible image. I often tell foreign audiences that we Filipinos can be very proud of our writers and literary resources. We have one of the world's freest presses and social media, where no topic and personage is taboo. But this is accompanied by an awful irony. For all our vaunted liberties, the Philippines is also one of the deadliest countries for journalists in the world. According to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, it ranked only to Iraq in 2013. We have only to think of Maguindanao to remember and to understand that, politically, it is the frontline journalist who takes the greatest risks and sustains the most grievous losses in the battle for the Filipino mind. By comparison, we fictionists and poets have it easy. Politicians read newspapers, not novels. Bureaucrats and generals can't understand Cirilo Bautista and Jamino Abad, and I'm not sure I do either. Creative writing hardly pays us anything, but we can say whatever we want and reasonably expect to stay alive and ambulant. Nobody in this country ever got killed or imprisoned in recent times because of a novel or a story. Neither has a Filipino despot been deposed because of a play or a poem. Journalism, on the other hand, can be a lethal enterprise, especially if you live and work far away from the glare of the metropolis. It's worth noting, of course, that we have brought down 3 presidents, Marcos, Estrada, and Arroyo, by means of media other than print. The massive street revolt that drove Ferdinand Marcos away in 1986 was called for on radio. The movement that hounded Joseph Estrada out of office in 2001 ballooned over SMS. Gloria Arroyo's disgraceful behavior in 2005 went all over the internet. I fearlessly predict that the next Philippine Revolution, whatever that will be and for whatever cause, will not be sparked by a novel, but by a viral video. But again, between now and then, what's a writer to do? It's become almost a cliche in itself to say that a writer's first responsibility is to the truth. This is no truer than today, in this age of fake news, post-truths, and alternative facts. Someone has to figure out what really happened, who's lying, and why. The fact that we respond to the news today mostly with consternation and skepticism only shows how difficult that task is, and how successful and how good the professional purveyors of lies, half-truths, and nuanced positions are at their job. Call them trolls, call them spin doctors, and yes, call them spokespersons. But whatever their motives are, whether they may be mercenaries or true believers, they have raised the bar for their white hat counterparts. The easiest and perhaps the most attractive role to take as an antagonist is that of a propagandist, especially online, to respond tweet for tweet, post for post, insult for insult, meme for meme. But the harder and therefore the more important task is to see beyond a moment and to engage the reader on a deeper and more thoughtful level. Clearly, we need investigative journalists with the courage, integrity, and tenacity to uncover the facts. Clearly, we need scholars and critics who can sift through the facts and data to make sense of this cleverly contrived and well-implemented confusion. For these writers, their mission is much more obvious. But what can the rest of us who know nothing but to write stories, poems, plays, and essays do? Propagandists employ the broad strokes of caricature, and there's a time and place for that. But beyond propaganda, beyond memes and hugot lines, I submit that the creative writer's true task is to do as we have always done, which is to go beyond the simple truth and the obvious to get at the truth of life, the complicated truth, the inconvenient truth, the truth that will drive evil out of the shadows and into the withering light. And by this, I don't mean just establishing the facts, although that is difficult and deserving enough. I mean the persistent affirmation of our worth and our infinite complexity as humans against the political powers that seek to oversimplify and dehumanize people by affixing labels of convenience on their bloody chests. This we know as writers. Life is complex. People are complex. The most trustworthy looking person can tell a lie. The most damnable crook can tell the truth. Our poems and stories return to this premise over and over again. Things are never what they seem. Fiction is all about character revelation and transformation. Poetry dissects one moment into many. What others accept as conclusions, we take as beginnings. Our lodestar is our natural curiosity and skepticism, without which we merely echo what others have already said and blindly accept the official narrative. The two most important words in our verbal armory are not even truth or justice. It's what if? Ano kaya? And this is how we must respond to the stereotyping, the homogenization, and the dehumanization of people that takes place in a time of terror. To rescue and preserve the individuality and humanity, not only of the victims, but also of their killers, because even evil must have a recognizable face. Fight the cliché. Resist the simple story. Refuse to be idiotized. In the American literature class I taught this semester, we took up 3 short stories we could all learn from. And not incidentally, whenever I teach American literature, I always make a point of reminding my students that we are studying the subject not to become Americans, but to become better Filipinos by replacing our awe of that country with critical understanding. These stories are The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, in which a whole town gets together in an act of communal murder. Good Country People by Flannery O'Connor, in which a Bible salesman is revealed to be a perverted cynic. And Going to Meet the Man by James Baldwin, in which a Sunday picnic turns out to be the backdrop for the gruesome lynching of a black man. These stories suggest to me that in the not too distant future, our own great stories, novels, and films will emerge out of this dark and turbulent period. We need a lottery, a Good Country People, and a Going to Meet the Man for our time and place. And when they get written, the story will no longer be just that of the rogue police going after innocent citizens, but also of our collective complicity in it, in our people's acceptance of EJKs as the norm. The biggest casualties of this present war have been justice and conscience. Malungkot man at malagim ang malawakang pagkawala ng buhay at kawalan ng hustisya sa panahon ng tokhang. Ang tunay at mas malaking trahedyang dapat nating tukuyin ay ang ating bulag-bulagan at bingi-bingihang pagtanggap nito. I will not argue that the war on drugs is a popular war, and that much of that popularity derives from the fact that drugs have destroyed many lives while enriching others. But as writers, we have to remind our people and our government that there are things far worse than drugs, and that the most powerful narcotic of all is the lust for power. Not all of us can be investigative journalists or soul-searching novelists. Hindi tayong lahat ang magkakaroon ng tapang, talino at tiyaga na sulatin ng mga dapat isulat. But I will consider that even the conscious assertion of life and beauty against a backdrop of death and terror can be an act of political resistance. During the Second World War, when Leningrad was under siege by the German army, and the Russians had resorted to eating leather belts, cats and dogs, and even flesh from corpses, a group of starving musicians came together to premiere Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. They played it on the radio, and even the Germans could not believe what they were hearing. The records say that after the war, captured German officers admitted that when they heard the Leningrad, as the Seventh Symphony came to be known, they knew they could never defeat the city. So art, my friends, is what keeps us alive and what keeps us human. Our art is our faith, the faith that will sustain us through our doubts and fears. As Leo Tolstoy reminds us, God sees the truth but waits. Nakikita ng Diyos ang katotohanan, ngunit siya lamang ang makakaalam at makapagpipili ng tamang panahon upang magpataw ng kanyang hustisya. Samantala, tayong mga manunulat ang magsisilbi bilang kanyang mga mata, bilang kanyang mga saksi. Manampalataya tayo sa Diyos, sa ating sining, at sa isa't isa, sa ikatatagumpay ng katotohanan at ng hustisya. Marami pong salamat at mabuhay tayong lahat.